Thank you very much. So welcome to the Land Steward Program Community Education Series. Our Community Education Committee meets at the start of every year and puts together a year's worth of classes. So we have classes booked through February, I believe, approximately one and a half a month. Some months there's two. And if you have questions or ideas for future classes, you're welcome to email Eugene. Eugene is our new program coordinator. I put his picture up here in case you haven't met him yet. And his email you can find not only on this presentation, but on the Land Steward Program website at OSU. And if you have any trouble finding that, you just type into Google OSU Land Steward Program, and you can find information about the program, upcoming classes. In fact, you'll even see this little subscribe button. You're welcome to subscribe if you're not already. And we send out class flyers for the Land Steward Program, sometimes for small farms or related Master Gardener programs that we think folks interested in land stewarding would also be interested in. And we don't spam you with anything other than a quarterly, which I think we're going to offer twice a year, a newsletter. And that just keeps you up to date on what kind of stuff's going on in the Land Steward Program. By the way, I don't know if I introduced myself. My name is Nicole Smith. I'm the Land Steward Education Assistant, and I've intermittent here and there, filling in, helping Eugene where he needs for planning the upcoming field class, which we will talk about in a moment. So we have some upcoming events. There are still spots for the field visit for the second part to collaborating with beavers. The field visit that's going to be out in Cave Junction. Is that correct, Jacob?
Yep, just outside Cave Junction.
Thank you. So there's still space if you would like to register and join in on the field visit. There is a class being put on by small farms, water rights and domestic wells, what farmers and landowners need to know. There's been some changes to some regulations. So you might want to pop in on that. There is an online fire resiliency for rural Oregonians, not a program that we're putting on at SOREC, but it is a related program through OSU. And then our big program that we're looking forward to is the return of the Land Steward Field Training. And that program will start in September 9th, and it's 11 Tuesdays from 12 to 5. Typically, the class meets for some conversation, debrief, lessons, and then they go out to different sites that represent whatever topics are being taught. So there's a variety of topics on wildfire risk reduction, healthy forests, soil health, wildlife, pasture management, enterprise, how to utilize your property, and are you planning on making money on your property? How are you planning on managing your lands? There's a lot of information that you can get from this class, and it looks like there is still an early bird discount through August, and there's also a discount for couples. So if you sign up multiple landowners on the same land, you get a discount for that as well. All right, I think that's all I have to say about that, but we are real excited for this to come back. It's a really super unique program, originated here in Southern Oregon, and we've been partnering with other counties to offer it as well. But it is a one-of-a-kind opportunity that we have to manage our lands. It's pretty wonderful. But today you all are here for collaborating with Beaver for a resilient future. And we have Jakob Shockey here. And I'm just going to read a little bit about Jakob, and I'm going to pass it over. So Jakob Shockey is a human father and husband, values community, truth, awareness, and grace. Works primarily with beavers and people, sings to himself, loves flying kites, and can't spell. I'm with you on that. I also can't spell. He also is the executive director for Project Beaver, a nonprofit that works to empower humans to partner with beavers and value their work. And he has been helping folks throughout Oregon live with beavers for over a decade with his business, Beaver State Wildlife Solutions. Thank you so much for being here, Jakob. We are very excited. I am going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. All right.
Cool.
Take
Thank you, Nicole. And hello, everybody. Let me share my presentation here. Okay, is that full screen? Excellent. All right. As Nicole said, I'm Jakob Shockey. Nice to join you all virtually. I'm coming to you from a cabin in the Applegate. And this is sort of what my neck of the woods looks like. I'm in Thompson Creek. Interestingly, the Applegate used to be called by the Tacoma the Sping, which meant place of the beaver. So it's a good spot to live if you spend all your time on beavers. I came to this work through sort of a roundabout way. I managed a restoration program for the Applegate Partnership for close to a decade. We did a lot of the bread and butter stuff that watershed councils do. We drug logs into side channels for fish habitat, and we targeted abandoned irrigation diversions for removal to help facilitate more salmon moving through. We ground up a lot of blackberries. This, to the one side of the screen, you can see the blackberries. We go in and masticate them, and then we plant new stuff there. This is at the Provault Seed Orchard site. I worked there probably 5 years before it opened, starting to try to get some of the blackberries off that land. And what we were purporting to do, and what so many outfits like the one that I worked with do, is we take grant money and we try to build habitat. And in my case, using many of the methods that were the state of the art at the time, I just noticed that I wasn't getting the habitat that I wanted to see. And yet, meanwhile, I would find places like this spot in the Illinois Valley. This is actually where we're going to be later this week. And it was created by Beavers, and the Beavers were doing something that I couldn't do with $500,000 Oregon lottery grants and nursery stock and large equipment that burns diesel fuel. So I pivoted to focusing on beavers, really just because it felt like a good use of my time as a human, rather than pretending to be a beaver inadequately. Really focusing on, okay, how do we get more of these stream restoration professionals to work, and see beavers as sort of that thing that tips us over into having habitat. So instead of trying to construct habitat, which was kind of the method that I learned, we would go out and survey an area that looks like really good habitat, and then you take that list of species back and you'd go to a spot that's super degraded and you'd try to reconstruct habitat. Instead of doing that, started approaching it as, okay, beavers have been managing habitat for millions of years. They know what they're doing. How do I get them back? What's the action that I can do that gets beavers back? And then, of course, when beavers are back, oops, what's going on with my presentation? There we go. You get the cascade of benefits after that, both the habitat, the water retention late into the season, the water quality, and all the wildlife that comes with it. Here's, there we go. So beavers are having a bit of a moment right now. There have been a number of kind of high profile media pieces. There was actually just a National Geographic article on them. And there's a lot of focus on them. When I started working with beavers about a decade ago, it was typically sort of a conversation you'd hear at a bar after hours among fish biologists. Like, oh, we really need to get beavers back. Have you seen the habitat that they create? And over the last decade, it's gone from kind of this huddle of fish biologists to kind of more accepted in the realms of people trying to recover salmon, to then a broader conversation about water quality, the dams that are holding back water late into the season, up in our where our snowpacks are coming off earlier and earlier every year. These dams help hold it back. And and the water quality that they bring. And then more recently, the conversation has broadened even more into fire. And there's been a number of papers that have come out looking at, okay, when you have beavers in a system like this, how fire behavior changes. Surprise, surprise, water doesn't burn. And if beavers have created these corridors of wetland habitat, those act like fire breaks and drop fire behavior even during the mega fires. So that's been kind of their arc over the last decade. Let's talk a little bit next about beavers. So just kind of a beaver biology 101. This is sort of a scene that you'll see if you come to a stereotypical beaver habitat. You've got the dam. Beavers don't live in the dam. That's what's holding back water for them. They build dams because they're trying to avoid getting predated. And so they have built this really nice dam in this picture. This is on Spawn Creek outside Logan, Utah. So if you're ever in Logan, Utah, this is a good hike. It's just outside the city. As you then kind of look upstream, you see a clutter of sticks in the frame. That's their winter larder. They've pulled a bunch of sticks down into the pond. They're expecting it to freeze, and they'll be able to access those sticks all winter. In the background, you see kind of a hump of sticks. That's their lodge. Their lodge is kind of up against the bank. That's where they live. They have an underwater entrance to that lodge. And then you can see their paths heading up into the aspens around. This is kind of what an underwater entrance looks like if you're kind of peering at it. So I'm standing sort of above the canal that leads to their lodge. You can see there's a nice downstream dam. This was an incised stream in the Portland area, but had beavers in it. And then this is what it looks like if you crawl up into that space. So this one was like, I don't know, 6 feet probably in circumference and pretty cozy. You can see the willows in there. And they're not like nutria. They don't turn a bank into Swiss cheese. They pretty much have their one pocket. Sometimes they'll have some emergency exits. And sometimes they can be pretty hard to see rather than a big mound of sticks on the side of a bank. Sometimes that they're up under a deciduous tree in the roots, and the roots help keep predators from digging in on them. Only in places where there's not a high bank that they can get into will you see them build that kind of classic conical lodge structure, which we'll see on Saturday if we can get out there far. They've done a good job flooding that site recently. And they're doing all of this to avoid predation. Beavers are 60 pounds often of slow-moving protein, and they everything wants to eat a beaver. So in our area, the primary predators were wolves and grizzlies. We had wolves and grizzlies not even 200 years ago here, and those are the types of predators that have driven beavers into building dams. And so when we see them creating a massive wetland out across the land, they're really just trying to keep the big cats at bay. Like, let's add water. Anymore, coyotes will try to go after the young ones. Black bears will dig into their den, but humans are the main predator of beavers, and just the lack of high quality habitat is another thing that probably limits them quite a bit. Cool, so this is a canal in the making. You can kind of see beavers are creatures of habit, and they'll create these little pathways out into their woodlot that they're managing. And they mate for life, and they're very territorial, and they'll hand down their territories over generations. And as they manage the woodlot and are out of sight for a long period of time, they'll turn their pathways into canals. So you can see kind of right here where that tree is coming up next to their pathway. Beyond that, they've started digging it down into a 16-inch canal. And they'll start using those to move woody debris back and forth. This is the other thing you'll often see, the little feeding rafts. So beavers are vegetarian or vegan. In the winter, they primarily eat the cambium, that green kind of tissue layer off of sticks. And they'll eat it like a corn cob, just back and forth. And they'll sit there and kind of accrue a whole pile of beaver sticks in a spot that they feel safe, like they can jump in if somebody's coming. So it's often pretty easy to tell if you've got beaver because they are really messy and they leave a lot of sticks behind. importantly, you often don't see that in spring and summertime when there's a lot of green herbaceous stuff. So I get a lot of calls from landowners that are like, beavers just moved in, usually toward the fall. And that's because the tender leafy green stuff is no longer available. And so they've pivoted to eating shrubs and trees. So there you go. That's kind of the overview. You got the dam, again, the lodge, that's where they live. They're out harvesting vegetation, bringing it down to the water, eating it at their leisure. And they only have 2 to 4 kits a year. Those kits then stick around for an entire year, sometimes two, as teenagers to help with the babies. So in a colony, in a family, you'll often have mom and dad and either one or two sets of yearlings and teenagers, and then the young of the year. They're born in May typically. So right about now is when you'll start seeing the fluff balls kind of coming out and interacting with the broader world with their parents. So here's a graphic of it. This is a complex evolved system. This is something that's been going on for a very long time. Beavers have been managing freshwater in the entire northern hemisphere, the top half of our planet, since before we emerged from the fossil record by a lot. I mean, humans came out of Central Africa into a northern Europe that was fully managed by beavers wherever there was fresh water. And so everything that needs fresh water during some part of its life cycle co-evolved with beavers. And we can do science, ecology surveys or whatever now, and we can draw a lot of connective tissue there and say, okay, well, when I don't know what I did there. When we see a beaver wetland, we get increased waterfowl production and nesting sites for birds and increased fish populations. And some of the early people or groups moving beavers around were groups like Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation and Ducks Unlimited, because they were recognizing beavers build wildlife habitat, and they were strategically trying to reintroduce beavers to areas simply for the fact that they were going to build elk habitat or duck habitat. This fellow, David Thompson, he was one of the early explorers, especially north of here. He came over with the Hudson Bay Company. He was conscripted from one of the boys' schools and spent much of his life traversing the upper part of the US and Canada, and made some of the early maps. And this is a quote from him from 1794, and he was thinking about the North America that he was moving through, and he said of North America, it may be said to have been in the possession of two distinct races of beings, man and the beaver. Except the Great Lakes, the waves of which were too turbulent, beaver occupied all the waters of the northern part of the continent. Every river where the current was moderate and sufficiently deep, the banks at that water's edge were occupied by their houses. To every small lake and all the ponds, they built dams and enlarged and deepened them to the height of the dams. Even the grounds that occasionally overflowed, these are our ephemeral streams now, by heavy rains, they also made dams, and they made them permanent ponds. And as they heightened the dams and increased the extent and added to the depth of the water, thus all the lowlands were in possession of beaver and all the hollows of the higher grounds. So that's a very different North America than we see today. And it's important just to find these little glimpses when we're looking at challenges to water and with fire and with species recovery, to remember that we had a complex evolved system here. And it looked more like this. Toe slope to toe slope, you would have had beaver wetlands. And you read the early trapper journals, and they talk about coming down into a valley and sometimes spending days trying to get across a valley, because they would need to find an old beaver dam, one that was big enough and old enough that they could brush it out and run their teams over it. And that was possible because often these things had been in the, across the valleys for sometimes hundreds of years. Importantly, the Sping, the Applegate, the place where I live, so you get flat areas by glaciers and you get flat areas by beavers. Those are kind of the two driving factors for valleys. And we remained unglaciated. So all of our flat areas like the Applegate were flat because it used to be a wide expansive beaver dam. So the ribbon of the Applegate River that you see, or Bear Creek, or even to some extent parts of the Rogue up where it goes through Table Rocks, for example, um, those are probably largely artifacts of human tinkering in the last 200 years. That's when you disrupt something like this and you drain it and you put it over the side so that you can farm. When the Applegate was like this, it functioned for a long time like a sluice box. So a sluice box is what you run muddy gravel through when you're looking for gold. And it's got a bunch of ridges in it and some screen, and you run all this muddy gravel through, and the heavy metals drop out, and you pick through the heavy metals. Those are your gold. Well, in the Applegate and the Illinois Valley and the Trinity Mountains and all of these areas, beavers had functionally built sluice boxes with their wetlands. And for millions of years, these gold nuggets, or at least hundreds of thousands in this area, gold nuggets were collecting behind these beaver dams. So they are largely responsible to some extent for the gold rush too. Here's a current beaver dam in our area. And you can kind of see that, like, there's some dams, you can kind of see some dams, right? That's the downstream line on those pools, but it really starts to be more of a sponge of water. Of course, beavers were trapped out of our area. They were trapped out primarily for these hats. This is like, you think of the classic Abe Lincoln top hat, right? Abe Lincoln was actually coming to the style late. It'd be kind of like me wearing a Western cattleman Stetson now. He was a politician, and he was bringing kind of a flair from the last century to his look. But these hats were in vogue in London and Europe 100, 150 years, even 200 years earlier than that. And so much of the Western expansion of the US, I mean, the pilgrims were sending back beaver pelts, and it just kept going all the way to the West Coast. In our area, beavers were literally the currency of the land. You could take flesh salted beaver hide into the Hudson Bay Company, and they would exchange it for basically a company coin. So MB on these, you see 5 MB, that stood for made beaver. And a made beaver was a fleshed and salted beaver hide. So it was, in a sense, a standard that the currency was backed by, and you could then take these to the company store and trade them for things. This was the first white guy into our area, a fellow named Peter Skin Ogden. He was not a cool dude. He killed some people on the East Coast. His dad was a judge. He was looking to skip trial, so he left a wife and a baby there and skedaddled out here. They were looking for a job for him. He was up in Fort Vancouver, right next to Portland, on the Washington side. And there was rumors that American trappers were pushing up from California, and they were wiping out all the beavers in California and going to move into Oregon. And Hudson Bay Company, remember, this is a British company, kind of quasi-governmental British company, was not wanting the infringement of the American trappers into their territory. So they sent this guy to create a fur desert between the Snake River and the Oregon coast, kill every last fur bearer through the Oregon territory. And thinking was, when the Americans got up to Oregon, that they would find such an impoverished landscape that they would turn around and go home. So this guy was the first guy into our area. When he was camping near present-day Klamath Falls, he wrote this in his journal. This is, I would have you note, 1827, so we're not even 200 years ago. He wrote of the tribes, and they were in kind of a skirmish at the time. May they destroy each other, the more the better. If fond of war, let them enjoy it, and we, in the meantime, will endeavor to wage war with their beaver. And that was totally the case. He was waging war on the beaver. He came down through where Immigrant Reservoir is now, over the Green Springs Immigrant Reservoir. He came down to present-day Grants Pass area, pushed up Murphy, up the Applegate. He camped at the base of Thompson Creek for a while. He was totally lost. He thought he was near Mount Shasta, so he sent some scouts up Thompson Creek and some scouts up the Applegate, and they ran into the Red Buttes, and Then he turned around and basically retraced his steps out of here, trapping beavers the whole time. Beavers didn't fare any better in Europe. It was just a few thousand years earlier that they got wiped out. Here's a medieval illuminated text showing beavers. You can see the beavers biting off its glands there. So beavers have two glands. That's not very realistic. They're internal. But they have two glands, and as they eat willow, they build up a compound very much like salicylic acid, which is the active ingredient of aspirin. Or analogous to the active ingredient of aspirin. So it was a highly prized medicinal in medieval Europe. And one of those glands was worth a year's wages to a medieval laborer. And they have two. Also, the Catholic Church decreed that because they had scales-ish on their tail and they swim in the water, therefore they're a fish. And so it was a red meat that you could eat during Catholic holidays when you're not supposed to eat red meat. Which made them really popular with people who could afford a beaver during those holidays. And so that was another year's wages. So you're at 3 years' wages if you caught a beaver, and that pretty much took out beavers throughout Europe. And here's a picture of the hides all baled up, getting ready to send to Britain. So beavers 200 years ago, 150 years ago, and before that have kind of there's been this period of like they're a natural resource to be extracted. The last 100 years or so, they've been a pest species, more or less. That's been our relationship with them. And then now we're kind of back to, oh, they're a natural resource, but then instead of extracting them, how do we welcome them, collaborate with them, keep them on the land in such a way that we enjoy all the benefits too that they're bringing. Because a lot of our streams look like this. This is Vesper Meadow up at the top of the Rogue. And you can see even just 100, 150 years of intensive grazing, and that stream has collapsed. That waterway that would have been like that shot that I showed you of the valley. And in many of the early GLO maps, it shows this is a whole marsh. Well, now it's a dry pasture, and the water table has collapsed, sometimes 8 feet in places. And you've got this sort of cut through the meadow that bleeds the moisture out of the meadow. Stream is a good word for it, actually, instead of a waterway. Now it's a stream, and the water's streaming away. And so our arid west is full of these. Many of you may even live on a piece of property with one of them. And when beavers move back into these systems, sometimes it's hard for them to get started because the velocity in that narrow confined channel is so great. But when they can make a dam and it sticks out through the wintertime, you get a really quick response. This dam had been in place for a year, and already you can see the willow, the hydrology, the water has soaked up into the soil enough to where willow is now starting to grow in a place that was dry before. And when it gets fully connected, this is a picture I took in Eastern Oregon, where one of the spots I like to hunt, you get something like this, where it's just this kind of green belt and these beaver ponds, and you can kind of see there's a curvature to it. Like, yep, there's a dam in there somewhere. And this is like the Serengeti watering hole. This is where everything goes all summer long. And in our area, it looks like this. It looks like the spot will be on Saturday. So talked a little bit about beavers, basic beaver biology, a little bit about the history that they've experienced here. Ogden came through, he wiped out all the beavers. And then it was about 20 years later that gold was discovered in Jackson Creek. So to finish the story on the gold, right, he wipes out all the beavers. The beaver dams kind of break down and collapse. They leave these huge mud flats, super fertile ground, and hidden with gold. The mud starts growing grass, and 20 years later, those are the gold fields. And you can look at places like the Trinity or the Applegate or the Rogue or the Illinois Valley, and gold miners just moved those creeks back and forth and mined as much sediment as they could out of those systems. And places like, parts of Deer Creek or Josephine Creek especially, or Jackson Creek, it'll be really hard for those to recover. But we've kind of taken a little bit of a approach to that. So this is a strategic framework, if you will, like, oh, great, how do I help beavers? Um, it scales. So this is with my nonprofit Project Beaver, this is what we're attempting on the scale of the Rogue Basin, but this would be the same process I'd recommend to anyone who's trying to work with beavers on their property uh, down at that scale too. So if you're excited to work with beavers, what do you do? Well, the first three steps that I'd recommend is basically homework steps. It's considering the land, um, trying to figure out, is there beaver habitat here? It's considering what's going on with the beavers and what's going on with the people. And we'll get into all this more. That's your homework. The land, the beavers, and the people, right? Here and now. And then also looking at kind of the past history. And then when you get into sort of doing things, well, the most important thing you can do is help beavers stay where they've chosen to live. Because if they stay there, not only are they building habitat there, they will eventually have young ones moving out into other spots throughout the basin. That's the most important thing we can do, followed by helping them fix areas that bowling alley, that incision, that cut is just too extreme and they can't really make the habitat work. And we can do a little bit. That's where our restoration really shines. And then finally, helping beavers find spots where it's just too far in the watershed or they've been extirpated from. We run a little refugee program that I'll talk about more. So in considering landscape, one of the things we did for the entire Rogue, and hopefully this is going to be accessible later this year on our website so you can find your property and pull it up. We ran what's called an intrinsic potential model. It's a nerdy effort to try to figure out where were the wetlands. And here's a little version of it that we ran for the Cascade Siskiyou National Monument, but you can kind of sort by good, better, best as far as hypothetical habitat and start to kind of understand, okay, this is the spots that we think they were. And then with the beavers, what we've been doing at the Rogue level is we've been trying to find where they're at and try to understand a little bit of the kind of thready population that we have here. So we've been doing these scavenger hunts. People volunteer to help us report where beavers are throughout the basin. And then we've also been slowly collecting some genetic samples from beavers that we interact with to start to get an idea of how they're related, and working with SOU so that their students get to work with actually meaningful samples and run PCR and help us kind of think through, is it a very small genetic pool? Do we have a larger genetic pool? What's going on? So this is the scavenger hunt. And if you hold your smartphone up to the screen now or later and go into your camera setting, it'll take you to the link for this. And so if you do run into Beaver Sign, it's very helpful. It's a kind of a simple app that runs you through it. You take a picture in the app, and anyway, we're collecting signs of beaver. So anyone who feels like they could help with that, it's always appreciated. And then consider the people. So like I said, the main predator for beavers here are humans. And beavers, remember, they're territorial, they mate for life, they've got this really tight-knit family. And they're going to choose the best habitat that's available when a young couple goes out to try to find new digs for itself. Or if there's an established couple and a nicer house opens up nearby, they'll move into that one. So what happens in our area is you have a bunch of really nice properties along main stem rivers, like the Applegate, like the Rogue, like the Illinois. And that's the best beaver habitat because beavers don't have to build a dam there. There's lots of deep water, so all they have to do is live in a bank. There's lots of willow. Life is great. I mean, beavers are like people. They kind of value real estate in the same sort of succession up into the watershed. And yet we have a lot of conflict with beavers on the main stem because they'll wander up and they'll chew down somebody's Japanese maple. And those folks will call, the local critter getter company, whomever they may be. And those beavers get trapped. And when the beavers are trapped, then that spot opens up and more beavers move in, and then they get trapped, and then that spot opens up and more beavers move in. And these are population sinks. These are like black holes in the beaver population. And our basin is full of black holes where people are just on this treadmill of trapping beavers. And what it does is it depopulates the whole region. So not only they are spending a lot of money on beaver trapping, but also their neighbors will never have beaver. Like whoever has the best habitat in the neighborhood, if they're not able to live with beavers for whatever reason, then no one in that neighborhood will, because that'll be the drain. So we spend a lot of time trying to work with those folks to help them coexist with beavers in that type of situation. And then we've been working on the policies at a statewide level too. So if any of you have questions about that, we got another law passed this year. I can talk about that again in the Q&A. So those are the homework, right? We're like, what's going on with landscape? What's going on with beavers? What's going on with people? You know, who are the people that are on this trapping treadmill? Can we work with them? And then we try to work with them. We try to help the beavers stay where the beavers are wanting to be. This is an orchard outside. Well, it's actually really close to the OSU Extension office on Hanley. And beavers were coming in and wiping out her little commercial apple plot. And so you can see there in the foreground, there's just a simple 2-strand electric fence that we put in. And that worked very well to stop all beaver predation on her apple trees. So let's get into a little bit of the conflicts, actually, while we're at it. Beavers do that. They also plug culverts. When they see a culvert, they think, well, that's a really good dam, and you left one hole. And they plug the hole, and people freak out. And so I've written 2 guides now. These are best management practices. Basically, the nerdy name best management practices help the state and other regulatory authorities point to this and say, okay, there's a guide. You know, when we say you can put in a pond leveler, this is what it means. And we worked with folks with Oregon Fish and Wildlife and NOAA and US Fish and Wildlife to come up with these. And so these are available on our website. It's basically all the nerdy details you'd ever need for putting in various flow devices. And we've also got a bunch of resources online for working with folks who are maybe on the trapping treadmill, or neighbors who are wanting to talk to each other. These are PDFs that you can hand out and share. But let's talk about the conflicts real quick. So beavers chew trees. Like we're saying, they're vegans. They need something to eat. All the trees in our area have millions of years of coevolution with beavers, and so they expect to be chewed down. Many of the willow species in our area do better with that coppice, with that like the cut and regrowth. But people like shade trees, and people don't like trees falling on power lines and houses and such, and so that leads to a lot of conflict. Also, we've planted ornamental trees in riparian forests now because we live there, and we've planted apples and those kind of things. And those trees don't have a history with beavers cutting them down. So when they cut them down, they're dead. Versus, even a big cottonwood like this is going to be regrowing. The other way beavers kill trees is by flooding them out. So you can see all the snags. It's a beautiful snag garden if you like bad habitat. But some people don't like the sight of snags either. And so the wet roots, especially for conifers, are another way that beavers kill trees, and people get upset about it. There's lots of ways you can protect trees. The simplest is just a simple wire mesh, something you'd buy at Home Depot, that welded wire that's 2 by 4 inches. Wrap it around. If you don't want to use T-posts, you can put a little flange in there. That's helpful too, because the beavers will stand on the flange as they try to lift it up, and they can't because they're standing on it. This is one of our info sheets that's on our website. Or you can do an electric fence like I talked about. This is an electric fence at a vineyard, and you can see they chewed down a vine there. There's a couple more. The dead leaves are a giveaway. But beavers come out of the water, they're soaking wet. They're the perfect animal to dissuade from going into an area with a little bit of electricity. We had a game cam on it once we put it up, and the beaver tried it once and never came back because there's a lot of food in in the place it was living too. So it works really well. The other thing beavers do they flood roads, they plug culverts. Somewhere deep in that pond or the waterway is a plugged culvert, and some human now has to get in there and figure it out, and that causes a lot of anxiety. They also flood agricultural crops. So this is a fescue, commercial fescue field, and they're losing about 3 acres of productivity to beaver wetlands. So there's a bunch of different approaches you can take to this. You can come in and just notch the dam. That's something that people commonly do. But beavers will build it back, and they'll build it back usually within the night. Another option is a pond leveler. This is like a standard pond leveler design. You're basically building a leak that the beavers can't detect at whatever level you want to set their dam at. And you're hiding that leak 40 feet out in their pond, and you're surrounding it by a cage so they never swim close enough to detect there's a leak there. These work really well. They're like draining your bathtub. They're do not exceed line on beaver dams, and they're very effective. Here's a couple more shots of it. That's kind of like what they look like on top. Again, this is the best management practice documents have a bunch of this, and these are variations if you've got a shallow stream or a narrow stream. Culverts, similar. There's a bunch of different ways to protect a culvert to keep beavers from damming interior to the culvert. Some of these give the beavers something to dam on, and then if you need to set the pond elevation behind it, you can put in a pond leveler. Some of these, like the one on the far right, a big trapezoid, it's just simply giving the beavers a fence that they can't get into the culvert, and they start damming next to the culvert at that choke point where they hear rushing water, and then as they get out on the wings, they get out into slack water, and it's no longer bugging them, and they'll leave the rest of it open, and so you have all your flow. Here's another picture of that, right? So you get these little dams, and importantly, there's wildlife passage, because lots of things like turtles and beavers even will go under road culverts, and then they get into a cage if there's not a spot for them to go out. But beavers won't go up onto land and then down in with their damming material. So this works pretty well. Here again is something where you're giving the beavers something to dam on, kind of reinforcing it. And then if you need to set the level, you put a pond leveler in. And that's sort of what it looks like above. And you can also, in this case, you can see there's no cage there. We just basically built our best effort at a beaver dam, and our hope is that they're embarrassed by that and they come in and they fix it. And in doing so, we get the dam away from the culvert, and then we can control it there, and the culverts can still operate like it's supposed to. I guess the final thing that beavers do that people really don't like is they burrow into berms. And sometimes berms, you know, even though they're not they're not turning this thing into condominiums, they still do have one cavity. So, excuse me, here's some slides from a friend in Europe. They have this problem a lot in Europe with any burrowing animal because all the rivers are very heavily diked. And this slide is pointing out that not all burrows are visible. You know, you've got the classic lodge on the one, but they can have a cavity that's invisible and an underwater entrance. And many folks have driven too close to a water's edge and dropped an axle into a beaver den before. This is usually the case with those. And there's options you can do, basically riprap covering. You can dig a slot and bury metal mesh, and they hit the metal mesh, they can't go any further. That works really well. Or you can do piling. It all depends. This is not something that's usually an issue for small landowners, but sometimes for the larger landowners, it's a real issue. Or if you have like a gully plug pond that you're worried about, etc. So that's the strategies for helping beavers stay. When we get to helping beavers fix the land that's super incised, like we were talking about with Vesper, there's this concept of process-based restoration, basically moving material that you can handle as humans, no machines involved. And instead of building something that looks like habitat, you're coming in and you're saying, what is the thing that we can do so the beavers can move in, and kicking off a process, right? And so in this case, often this looks like building fake beaver dams. And we use a hydraulic post pounder, and you're basically like a kid in a creek, you're building a beaver dam. And this is the info sheet we made on this. Basically, that the idea is you're starting to slow the water, you're building speed bumps. And as that happens and you get floods, the water kicks around and starts to erode places and gets a little bit wider and starts to deposit sediment in places. And as that happens, the water table is able to be retained a little bit higher, and then you follow that with willow planting, and you can start to get habitat enough for beavers to take over and get your waterway back from a stream. This is kind of another overview of that. So you're adding dams. You can see the water table is super low. BDA in this context is beaver dam analog. It's kind of the picture I showed you. And then those are trapping sediment, and the creek is evolving to either side. And as that happens, the hope is you're kicking off the hydrology so you get more green, and with more green and slower water, the beavers can show up and take over. This is one we built where they did exactly that. It was very exciting. So you can see the human post there in the foreground, and then a bunch of beaver chewed sticks in the background. They were embarrassed by ours, and they improved it and had it caulked, and it was amazing. And then willow planting is a big deal. If you're trying to draw beavers in, that is the easiest thing you can do to draw beavers in. Is just plant a ton of willow on your banks, and they really like willow. It's really easy to plant. Best to do when it's dormant, although you can technically kind of do it anytime. And you're just cutting stakes. You're shoving them as deep as you can in the bank or the mud or whatever. You want that stake to be wet year round. That's the main secret. And then don't leave too much of it dangling because it'll dry itself out. So you kind of clip it, give it 3 buds or something above the ground, and then clip it. So here Andrew is staking a beaver dam we were trying to help persist, and he's going to go ahead and clip those even shorter, so that there's just a little nubbin sticking out. It's enough. It's like rooting any plant. And then finally, the last thing we've been doing, we've been moving refugee beavers from spots where people just really don't want the beavers there and really want us to move them. And it's a good alternative to just creating a population sink there with lethal removal. So here my daughter is handling one of the beavers and some volunteers. We move them in elk bags. They're very breathable. It's easy for me to sanitize afterward. And the beavers curl up. I think it's a lot more comforting to them to be in a kind of close, soft, confined space than, say, in a big rattly stainless steel box being carted out into a waterway. We just hike these guys in, I don't know, about a mile. And this is all, I guess the promise of this in getting beavers up into the watershed and giving them on land. This is the bootleg fire that came through, and this was at this point, a catastrophic stand replacing burn. And even though many of the beaver dams burnt in this fire, you can see the reduction of fire severity, even in this spot where everything torched, even the needles off, where there was a big beaver wetland like this. So, in wrap up, this is the property we'll be at on Saturday. It came up for sale. Project Beaver was able to purchase it, which was really exciting. It's the biggest beaver wetland that I know of in Southern Oregon on private land. And the history here is basically some folks bought it who lived in California, and they thought they would retire up here, and they never did. And so for the last 30 years, beavers have done a fully unpermitted restoration project, and they punched a bunch of holes in the dikes, and they flooded things, and it's absolutely fantastic. And it gives you a good idea sort of that evolution from a stream into a waterway. And the goal here is eventually to have a boardwalk. So those of you who are joining me on Saturday will see, we're going to be on the edge, and we're going to be peering in. It's going to be kind of hard to see some things, and I'm going to do my best to get you out there. But the goal is to have a boardwalk at some point, a place where people of all ages and abilities can get out and actually be fully in a beaver wetland. There's nothing like it. The red-winged blackbirds are singing, the birds are everywhere, and it's just glorious. Here's a couple pictures of that area, and you can see the conical lodge, like that big structure. There's no bank left anywhere for the beavers to get into, so they had to build that. And with that, I'm done with that stuff. So let's chat.
Wonderful. All right. I was just responding to a question, but let's go ahead and get started. We'll go back up to the top. Let's see here. Oh, I had a question. It kind of sounds like beavers are keystone species.
Yeah, that's a term that folks use. It's referring to that Roman arch with the main keystone, and you pluck the stone out and the whole thing crumbles. Um, Biologists have often used that term to describe animals who have an outsized impact on the land and the ecology. And so you can use keystone, you can say they're an ecosystem engineer. Other animals that fit that category would be like prairie dogs or bison on the plains, redwood trees. Um, these species that are in their own ecology, and yet they're creating the ecology itself that everything else evolved to. So yeah, they're a keystone, and it's not surprising that then we're seeing a collapse of all the animals that rely on a waterway under beaver management when the waterways are no longer under beaver management.
Nice. Cameron wondered, how far do they wander from their lodge?
So their territory size seems to be contingent upon how much food's available. So you'll have one family, and then how big the area is that they're kind of maintaining. It's super dense habitat where there's a lot to eat. They can be packed in pretty tight. Sometimes multiple families will even be sharing one dam, in one waterway, and you'll see a beaver lodge over here and a beaver lodge over here. But then in the areas where, like Eastern Oregon, where there's not a lot and they have to go longer distances, sometimes one family's in over a half a mile. So that's one part. It's like once they're settled, where do they move around? We don't actually know how they choose their spot that they're going to live. In biology, there's various things you can study, and one of them is site selection. Where does an animal choose to live? And another is mate selection. Who do they choose to live with? And for beavers, they live in the spot that they choose for the rest of their lives, and they mate for life. So these are two really important decisions, and yet we have no idea what goes into those decisions. I mean, we know more about most animals than beavers, even though they're common, and it's just really hard to design a study where you could start getting at that. And so no one has. We don't know anything about like, oh, you're cute. Like, how are they? We know that they don't really. They're really good about not inbreeding, and that's about it because we can run genetics on that. And we've seen individuals move sometimes 23 miles looking for a spot. So they wander. They'll move around. I guess the last piece I'd add to that is many of the early naturalists would say that beavers went on summer vacation, and it really does seem that way. I've seen that at a number of sites too, where there's like a period that it seems like they're almost absent, and then they come back. And the hypothesis is they're looking for better digs. Like, hey, did anything else open up? Let's cruise. There's not a lot that we have to do. Like, this is a summer vacation period. And that's usually where you'll see beavers pivot to a new site if a new site opens up. And that's when you'll lose beavers if somebody started trapping downstream and then they decide to go move to the downstream spot because now that spot's open. Yeah.
Cool. Can they reclaim a deeply channeled stream into a more gradual one?
Yeah, but sometimes they need help. So depending on the velocity of that stream, it'll blow out their dams in the wintertime. And you can do things like you can just add T-posts to their dam to help them stick. Or you can take like a gas-powered post pounder and take a really, really fat willow, something that'll still fit in the chalk, and wrap it in duct tape. And then you can pound those down into the post, and then they'll literally sprout. And so you're kind of giving it roots. So there's strategies if you've got a beaver starting in there. But if you don't, then it's really stuff the wound, pack the wound yourself, right? Try to get that waterway back up a little bit. And hopefully then you can kind of bring in the professionals as you get it back up. Like Jackson Creek, for example, just to pick on the one right through the OSU extension area, that thing's like 15, 20 feet in size. Beavers are actually living in that. They've got these little Hoover dams, but folks trap them. I mean, Hamley Farm has trapped them. And so, uh, you know, you've got the population sinks there. And yeah, people kind of have gotten comfortable with standing on a bank and looking down at water. Um, it doesn't help our water tables. It doesn't help any of the ecology. It doesn't help your field next door that's totally dry, but it feels contained and controlled. I mean, until you get a big flood, and then it wreaks havoc on your banks and you get a lot of erosion. In Europe, one of the main reasons that they're looking at trying to bring beavers back is actually flood control. So if you have enough beaver dams high in a watershed that are slowing and spreading and sinking the water, when you get a big flood and you get that huge peak in the hydrograph, you actually see it kind of broaden out spatially and temporally. So over time and space, the water kind of, there's more of a battery to absorb it, and you don't get these huge chocolate milk things that, you know, kind of scour and maintain the incised streams that we have. So it's tricky if you're in a really incised stream to start getting it back. But yeah, pack the wound, add speed bumps, add willow.
That sounds like what Amber recommended, gully stuffing method. Sounds similar to what you're saying of
Totally. Yeah, but build it like a beaver. So don't just stuff your slash from your forest thinning project in there, because the water will go through it and you'll just have a bunch of dry slash. Beavers are in there and it's like 50% mud, 50% fiber, like fiberglass. And so the typical way that you would build like a beaver dam analog, and you can Google BDA, beaver dam analog, and there's a bunch of instructions out there. But you're layering mud and sticks, and you're watching the water track up behind you as you're stuffing. And that's very helpful, because otherwise, if you just have a loose aggregate of sticks and branches, most of your flow is going to go through it, and then you're going to get the big flood, and it's just going to take it all away. That's been my experience, having just been tinkering on my own property and having been doing a lot of restoration for the last, whatever, more than a decade. That's what I would recommend. Just spend the time and get the water behind it. And the cool thing is then you're actually meaningfully sinking water into your water table too as you build that.
slow the water down.
Yep.
Amber asks, are there certain trees that they don't like or won't eat or fell? For example, large established trees that provide shade or retain toxins, etc.
Yeah, the toxins is an interesting point. So a lot of, well, pretty much all shrubs and trees have some sort of chemical defense against browsers. And so they'll load up on phenolic compounds, on toxins, to try to keep browsers from eating them. And if you're a browser, you'll eat one thing a little bit, one thing a little bit, one thing a little bit, so that you don't build up too much of one toxin, because then that's when you get a stomach ache or worse. And so beavers will do that a little bit, but they kind of come in and hack the system, because when something gets big, it no longer has to spend any energy on chemical defense. It's out of the range of browsers. And so often with your bigger trees, like a big ash tree or a big maple tree or a big cottonwood, that's a very sweet tree if only you could get to it. But nobody can get to it except for the beavers, who come in and knock it down. And then you'll watch all the other wildlife that browses, so elk and deer, will come flooding to any tree that a beaver has knocked down, because it's the sweetest thing around. So in a sense, they do target kind of larger stuff, and that's what gets them in trouble with people, because we really like the shade component. They don't really care about the shade component. They're in like a cool, cozy lodge, and they're in the water all the time. And when there's a bunch of sun on the creek, it grows a bunch of willows for them. And so to some extent, they seem to be. But there's an intelligence to what they're doing that we can't really tell. I mean, they're long-term stewards of the land. They're going to be stuck in this one spot their whole lives, and they pass it down through generations. And you'll watch. I mean, it looks like a forester managing woodlot. They'll pass up a tree for many, many years, and then one day that one's the one that they've decided to cut. As far as species, any of the native trees, they co-evolve with beavers. Beavers will pretty much target them. I mean, like incense cedar and oaks and some of these things are less likely, madrone, they're way less likely to go after those unless they are kind of desperate. Same with like 9-bark, they're less likely to go after than red osier dogwood. There's some, but if it's native, they probably eat it. And then if it's introduced, they probably see it as a novelty and eat it too. So yeah, if you got something you care about, the best is to protect it.
And I appreciated some of your protection ideas. I think that may have also been related to Amber's question. Amber, did that answer? You want to unmute and clarify?
That was awesome. Perfect. Thank you.
Wonderful. Cameron asks, how do you go about getting some beaver relocated to your land and into the streams? I did share your website, live trap relocation information, but did you want to expand on that? I know Cameron had to leave a little early, but is looking forward to seeing you on Saturday. But if you, for the sake of everyone else, want to share how do we get beavers on our land?
Yeah. So with the relocation requirements that ODF&W published in 2017, they pretty much put a full stop to moving beavers onto private land. I mean, technically it's still allowed, but you have to get landowner signatures from landowners. I believe it's either 3 or 4 miles upstream and downstream of where you live, which is onerous unless you live on the east side or something where you've got 4 neighbors in that, or 1 neighbor, you're the person. I mean, on Thompson Creek, it'd be all of Thompson Creek would need to sign a petition to say, let's move some beavers here. So that pretty much has stopped any relocation onto private land for moving refugees. And so we target kind of high in the watershed water bodies where I feel like I can put them out in a, like for example, Bolin Lake in the Illinois Valley. I want to put beavers there at some point. They were there in the past, somebody killed them, but there's lots of willow, so I know that they're all going to have something to eat. There's lots of deep water. I know that I'm not feeding cougars a family of beavers that night. And then chances are they're at some point, maybe summer vacation, they're going to trickle down and find something else. But that's at their own discretion. So that's the strategy we've taken with the refugee program. And unless that ever changes, landowners' hands are pretty tied as far as relocating beavers onto their land. That said, most of us, if you have water and you have habitat, there should be beavers. And if there's not beavers, then my recommendation is start talking to neighbors and find the black hole in your neighborhood, because chances are you have somebody who's on some sort of trapping treadmill and probably just doesn't know that there's other options. I've yet to meet somebody who is on a trapping treadmill and doesn't want to get off of it. And so that's often often when people start talking to neighbors and reaching out, somebody has some culvert on a driveway that's an issue and they take out beavers regularly there.
Does that having to check in with neighbors up and downstream, is that regardless of how large your property is? I'd imagine if you have a long section of watershed.
Yeah, then you're better off. Yeah, and I don't remember the mileage count, but basically it's from the point where you put the beavers in the water. So if you have a long property, then it buffers you. If you're that ranch out in Lakeview, you could move beavers to your land, or any of these big properties. But yeah, and if you have a bunch of neighbors that were all on board with it, you can hypothetically move beavers there too. It's just it's onerous on the landowner to do the legwork. It's really just a petition, go up and down your road and get people to sign. And if you were looking at doing that, like if I was trying to move beavers here to Thompson Creek and I thought they'd stick on my property, I would go up and down the road and I'd say, hey neighbors, I want to do this thing. Here's why. If they move off my land onto your land, I'll be here to help you if they cause any problems. Like be ready to offer tree protection and step up and help them a little bit. And people usually are pretty amenable to that.
Cool. The QR code that you shared, I don't know if anyone else had success with it, but I couldn't. It said no data available.
Uh-oh. All right.
Was that an app?
Yeah, it takes you to Survey 123 and specifically to our our like collection app. So what I can do, let me type in the chat here my email address. And if anyone's interested, I'll just send you the link and the little instructions. And it would be, I would love anyone's help. You can just have it on your phone, and then when you see beaver chews wherever you're at, it's like 30 seconds, and then we know, oh, there's beavers there, which is really helpful.
If you could email Eugene and I the link, we'll add it in our email when we send out the link to the recording. And if
Oh,
you're
excellent. There we go.
PowerPoint, so we can, any resources you want to share to folks, we'll send a follow-up email. So that would be a great one.
Cool.
Wonderful. Amber's wondering, do they have protected status?
So it's getting better. We helped pass a law 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, House Bill 3464, that changed them from being considered a predator to being considered a fur bearer. So as a predator, they were lumped in with ground squirrels and anything else that the state wanted to legally designate as something that you can kill without talking to anyone. You can kill them at any time, as many as you want, whenever you want. And beavers have been that for a while. And so there was no data coming in as how many were dying from landowner conflicts, etc., pest control companies. So that was a big deal. It took it kind of pests, predators were under the auspices of Oregon Department of Ag, and it moved it into the purview of Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife as a fur bearer. They now have about as much protection as a raccoon, you could say. Which is to say, technically, you're supposed to call your local ODFW office before you kill them, and they'll say, "Well, can you try to live with them?" You know, or they'll issue you a permit to kill them, depending on how they feel about beavers locally. But that's better. And then this year, the governor actually just signed it. There was a law that was put together and championed by the representative and senator from my district, Rep. Pam Marsh and Senator Jeff Golden. And it was an effort to say, okay, we are seeing all this science that beavers improve water quality. We have a Department of Environmental Quality list that says these are all the streams that are really struggling with that. And so on public land, let's stop killing beavers where they're improving water quality. So is it kind of a limited sort of, let's take a pause on trapping on public land, not rivers, where the streams are deemed impaired. So it was like 4% of the beavers that are killed for fun every year, the recreational fur take, will be impacted by that law. So the hope is, I mean, the reason I was in support of it was that many of the places I move refugees, those are the streams that would qualify. And it's really frustrating to spend a bunch of time moving family of beavers, getting to know the family of beavers, and then someone goes and recreates and the whole family gets trapped off. So anyway, that's a recent development too. But other than that, you know, it's pretty easy to kill beavers, and thousands are killed every year in our state.
Oh, I didn't realize that was still kind of ongoing.
Oh yeah, there's hundreds killed along the Applegate and the Rogue every year just for tree damage. I mean, pest control companies are killing beavers throughout our region by big numbers. So yeah, it's really good to talk to your neighbors and be like, let's fence your maple tree or whatever, because that's the quiet thing that's happening.
Mm-hmm. Do beavers ever chop down so many trees that they have to move to an area with more trees? Asks Doug.
Rarely. So I've seen them move around sites in Eastern Oregon, and it seems almost like, you know, you're letting your field go fallow for a while. Their territories will be much broader areas, and they'll kind of be pivoting around that site. But willows, cottonwoods, maples, ashes, you know, a lot of the stream trees that co-evolved with beaver, they come back with even more tasty biomass the next year. And so it's really hard for them to eat themselves out of. And remember, they're kind of pivoting to herbaceous stuff over the spring, summer. So those trees get a good head start. And the trees, when it gets cut, it bumps up its phenolic compounds. And so those ones are a little bit more bitter. And so it usually can get a good year or 2, 3 before the beavers start kind of nibbling at it again. Anywhere on the west side, I've never seen beavers eat themselves out of a spot.
Joe, I could got some cottonwood suckers for them to work through on our property,
There you go.
chase around. Drea was asking, where can I acquire willows for planting? We have a beaver dam on the land we just moved to, and I want to encourage them to stay. I asked if they had any willows already existing, and they said, I don't believe so. It's pretty overgrown, so I haven't fully surveyed the plants yet, but haven't seen any willows. So where would you recommend acquiring willows for replanting?
So I feed out a lot of willows to the refugees, and so I start hunting willows everywhere. You can actually find a lot of willows on Forest Service roads, interestingly. Kind of high in our watershed where you've got snowpack, sometimes even just the upstream side of the ditch will be like kind of a thicket of willows, and the Forest Service folks have to go in and they'll go masticate them down with a mower every couple of years. And so they're sprouting back and they're kind of at that perfect thumb thickness. Easy to clip with hand loppers and load up a truck bed or a trunk or whatever. That would be my first recommendation. Another spot, when I worked with the Applegate Partnership, there was a willow coppice bed at the Provault Seed Orchard that we started. And the partnership harvests from that for the restoration project, but they can never use all the willow that are there that can be harvested. So you can reach out to them, and often they'll be like, yeah, come clip some willows here too. So, and they just start looking at roadside ditches. Anywhere that's in the public domain, there's actually a lot of willows that you can go in, and it doesn't do anything but good for the willow. And typically road folks enjoy somebody clipping down the vegetation on the side of the road too. So it's sort of a win-win.
Suppose too, if you want to buy already rooted ones, there are, the nurseries. And I know at the extension, the native plant nursery, I bought a couple of willows that I'm just waiting for the right spot to put them in, because our creek is seasonal. So
yeah, keeping them wet year round is the trick. Finding a spot.
Let's see. Ross says, I heard about a flood in New York State about 30 years ago when a beaver dam broke, flooded and carried off some houses, killed a few people. Is this possible?
Totally. It's less possible if it's not just one big dam, right? So when beavers are in control of waterways, they build a lot of little dams. And so you don't have like this Hoover Dam where it's a catastrophic dam collapse like it always is when people dams break. Typically it's like speed bumps all over the watershed. And so one fails, well, another one catches it. It's kind of no big deal. And again, that's why Europe is really obsessing over getting beavers into their watersheds, because they keep having levees fail or dams breach, human dams, and take out villages because there's these huge plugs of water that come down. So in a system where you've got multiple dams, it's actually the opposite. It's a much safer system. But if you have one lone beaver dam and then it gets hit by a flood and it fails, yeah, you're going to just have the same storm surge as any other dam failure. And there's things you can do. Like I said, you can reinforce it with posts. You can reinforce it with willow stakes. And yeah, that's kind of the situation with that. I guess the last thing I'd say on it is if you mess with it, probably even stakes count. I know definitely notching counts. There was case law set in Washington state where the storm was coming. They were worried. They notched a beaver dam, cut a slot down to like alleviate the pool. Storm came, blew out the beaver dam the rest of the way, blew a bunch of water through the downstream neighbor's living room. And the fellow who notched the dam was held liable to replace the carpet and floor and everything in his neighbor's living room, because they said it was a natural system. It probably would have held, except you destabilized it. So by doing something, you're now liable. And that's consistently with case law. People have never been held liable for having a beaver dam on their land, even when the beaver dam is catching a bunch of righted water and sub-irrigating or direct irrigating their fields, and they don't have water right to it. People sue over that all the time. And every time the judges say, The beavers have a right to be there. It's a natural system. As long as you don't mess with it, they do what they do. But when you touch the dam, you're taking the liability onto yourself, is how the decision has gone thus far. So it's something to be aware of.
Interesting. Are beavers nocturnal?
Now they are, but interestingly, that seems to be something that we did to them recently. So if you look at a beaver's eye, it has, so you've got two photoreceptors, right? Two types, rods and cones. Cones are the ones that bring in color. When you look at animals that are diurnal, and they spend all their time in the daylight, they see color, they have a lot of cones. When you look at nocturnal animals, they have a lot of rods. Rods are black and white, but they let in a lot of light. When you look at beaver eyes, they're mostly rods. So that suggests that cones. That suggests that they spent a lot of time outside in the daytime. Also, they don't have a reflective membrane in the back. So, like when you're driving your car and you get eye shine from a deer or something, beavers don't have eye shine. Eye shine is a reflective membrane in the back of the eye that also captures limited light and bounces it around and helps. So their eyes evolved as a animal that's out during the day. And the early trappers talk about them working all day. I mean, you read some of the early writers like Enos Mills, and he's talking about watching 30 beavers log all afternoon in a section of Aspen. But artificial selection is what we call it when, with like livestock breeding, you want one trait or another. We came in and we killed every beaver that showed itself. And it really seems to be that the survivors were the ones that went into the night. And in a sense, we drove them nocturnal. So now you'll see them classified as nocturnal or crepuscular, which means dawn and dusk. But it's because they're the survivors. I mean, a human analogy would be like you come in after a genocide and you look at the refugee camp and you're like drawing conclusions about how humans like to live based on what's going on with the people who survived. Like that is the situation. As a wildlife biologist, that's the situation where we're at, where we're like at 1% or less of a population that used to be the main driver of an ecosystem. And then we're trying to draw, generalizations about how they live. So the survivors are now nocturnal, but it doesn't seem to be the case. And when you see them in a zoo or someplace where they feel safe, a landowner that has kind of a sanctuary, if you will, for a long period of time, they'll start coming out in the day. Sometimes it takes a generation or two, but they'll pivot to daytime if they feel safe.
I've got a couple questions from Manuel. First one, are beavers sensitive to gunshot noise? Is there a possibility that such disturbances could cause them to abandon an area?
Yeah, for sure. Beavers, remember, classically, they slam their tail down on the water as their warning signal, which sounds a lot like a gunshot. So in their mind, that loud sound is there's a predator, everybody underground or underwater. So I could see if that was happening a lot, you could just frazzle their nerves and they would leave. I think that's way more likely to cause beavers to leave than dogs being present or traffic. Beavers will be really close to proximity to roads. That doesn't seem to bother them as much. And I don't think it's that they know it's a gun and that could kill them. I think it's because it would be analogous to basically the most direct stress signal that they have over and over and over again. If there's an area that's being, there's a lot of shooting.
That's a good point. If beavers are already established on the property where we will be living, are there any specific considerations we should take into account, especially given that the previous landowners did not engage in any activity there?
Just look at the trees that you want to keep and think through that. I think that would be my first recommendation. And remember, it's both chewing them down, but it's also drowning them. And so if there's the waterway is close to something that you feel like could potentially drown and you want to drop a pond a little bit, that's when your pond leveler is really your friend. So you can kind of come in and the good news is if the beavers have been there a while, it's a pretty stable situation. When beavers first move in, that's usually they're remodeling, right? They're putting up dams left and right. They're cutting trees. Humans are like, whoa, that's way too much for me. But if they've been there a little while, things have probably stabilized to where it's probably they're happy with what they've got. So if you're happy with that too, then it can work out. But yeah, just think about what they're eating, and if you care, if any of those things are special and you don't want to see it go. And then also, you know, like the wetland that we'll be at on Saturday, when we bought the property, there's a house there and a well and such. So we had to go through the whole inspection. They hooked up their pump to the well and they hit water at 2 inches and they pulled as hard as they could and they couldn't get the well to drop at all. Like that's how reconnected the water table is in an area that's drought prone. So the beavers are doing that under your property the more you let them do it. But at some point, if you want to utilize some of the property for other things, you might look at pond levelers.
Let's see, Emmanuel's got one more question, and then I'll open up if they want to ask any clarifying questions. When is the beaver breeding season? Are there particular precautions we should take during that period to avoid causing stress or disruption to their natural behavior?
I think breeding is probably less important to cause stress for than when they have their babies in the den. And so that is kind of that April, May, June period. That's when they're feeling, you'll watch like the activity that we see goes way down because they're just trying to be kind of quiet homebodies. And they'll stop working on their lodge and they'll stop working on their dams and they're just kind of eating quiet herbaceous stuff and trying to not have anyone notice them. That's the period where they're kind of the most vulnerable because they have little ones in the den. So if you know where the den is, you can kind of avoid the den. That's great. I mean, beavers are pretty resilient. They're not wildlife that you necessarily have to tiptoe around, which is cool. And you know, even the ones that I move, like I'll put them in my truck with me in the cab and they're sleeping in the bag and you know, you can handle them. They're like big rabbits. Yeah, they seem to be really resilient as far as it goes, but they are also wild animals. So yeah, that March or April, May, June, that's kind of the period where they're the most sensitive. And if they don't like the spot, you'll still have them there, but as soon as their babies are big enough, they'll bail. So it's like if they're stressed during that period, they'll say, okay, it's summertime, let's go find new digs.
Okay. Manuel, do you want to unmute? Is there any other clarifying questions, comments you want to add?
No, thank you. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Doug says, I listened to a presentation from the Dakotas during the pandemic where they were removing the beavers because they were affecting bald eagle habitat. Is that a concern in our area?
I haven't heard that. I'd be curious exactly what they were doing to bald eagle habitat. I mean, we move beavers for all sorts of reasons as humans. Like at one point we were taking them all out because they were building dams and blocking fish habitat. And they still do that in places, even though fish co-evolved with beavers, you know, we dynamite dams to let fish through. But there's a funny bumper sticker that a bunch of us were passing around at one point that says beavers taught salmon to jump. It's like one of the nerdy biologist stickers. You can spot us with those. Anyway, the point is this is millions of years of relationship. And yeah, I'd be curious what the eagle story actually was and how they were impacting the eagle habitat because there is a long-term relationship with beavers and eagles too. But yeah, in our area, I don't know of anyone taking out beavers for any other specific wildlife. I mean, even with, you know, one of the concerns you heard a lot at one point before it was studied was, well, beaver dams are going to increase the water temperature and we need a low water temperature for salmon habitat. You know, and they're cutting down trees that, you know, so the water's going to heat up more. But when you actually look at the data, when you throw a bunch of temperature loggers in the creek, what you find is, you know, if there's a human dam, it's concrete and the water's spilling over the top. And so, yeah, the stream warms downstream of that because you're sourcing the hottest water off the impoundment and you're putting that downstream. Unless it's something like the Applegate Lake where they're pulling from the bottom and then you're sourcing the coldest water and salmon aren't even growing in the Applegate. Like juvenile salmon's growth is retarded because they are so cold. We're refrigerating them in the summertime. But you need mixture of warm water for the rest of the ecology, like spots for frogs to oviposit and and because beavers are building canals and they have dams, and there's like, when you wade through a beaver wetland, you're hitting cold, hot, and then their dams are porous, and so they're sourcing water throughout, like from the bottom, from the middle, from the top. And so there's been a bunch of studies now that show that beaver dams actually cool water. En masse, they cool water. Like you can measure downstream. That was the last sort of long-standing argument against beavers, like streams are healthier without beavers, and that one kind of fell after people started putting temperatures or monitors in. So yeah, who knows what the eagle story is? Maybe I'll Google Dakotas and bald eagles and see what that was about. But typically they bring in a lot of fish and things that eagles eat. So yeah, I don't know.
Before Brendan left, he said, big thank you. Your knowledge and passion on the topic shows, and thank you for sharing this evening. Best of luck with your work to come. It's like we have a couple of folks from soil and water conservation districts throughout Oregon.
Cool.
So that is exciting. Amber also had to leave early and is looking forward to the field visit this weekend. And Doug is wondering, slower water would increase the water temperature. Is there a max water temperature for beavers? Oh, and then he's saying you just answered it. But is there a max temperature that they don't like?
I don't know. That's a good question. I'm sure that the water could get too hot for them. I mean, they're covered in a really dense fur coat, so it would probably get too warm for them, just like everything else. Yeah. A lot of what you see with beaver wetlands too, just to expand on that, is as the water table is being recharged, you get what's called a hyperrearic flow, which is water has been forced down into the dirt or the gravel or whatever, and then it comes back up. Like the pressure of the head of the water behind the dam is forcing it then back, and it's super cold as it's coming back because it's been sitting in the ground. So often you'll get a lot of hyperrearic flow at developed beaver wetlands too. And you can usually spot those. If you're walking through it, you feel it. But then that's where the clouds of juvenile fish are often at, is those regions where it's the cold water coming back.
Okay. Will they eat canary grass, Sparkle wonders?
No, but they'll flood it out. I haven't actually seen them eat canary grass, but they do. There's been some sites where, you've got a massive field of canary grass, and then beavers come in and they start flooding it, and they start punching canals all over the place. And same with blackberry, canary grass. Like these are species that are adapting to a niche that didn't exist in our landscape. Like there was nothing that was a dry riparian bank. That wasn't a thing, right? The riparian forests with the native plants that we have were wet because they were down in beaver wetlands. Like these were the forests that were in, high water table area. So a dry riparian bank, it's a thing people made. And so then we've got some introduced plants that do really well in that niche. And nothing that co-evolved here does well in that niche because that wasn't a niche. And so, you get Bear Creek, and instead of Bear Creek acting like a buffer to a wildfire, if it was, full of beaver wetlands and it's this incised stream, it's totally covered in blackberry, and it was a wick, it ran fire through our cities. So that's the thing that happens, and it happens through canary grass and it happens with blackberries, but beavers will eat blackberries. That's good news. And then also they flood them out. And so you'll get these like tendrils. You'll see blackberries on Saturday. I mean, they're around, but they're mostly around where I have the pond leveler, and I'm trying to keep the house from being fully underwater before we can take it away. And it's where I, as a human, am maintaining a dry riparian bank. And as soon as they start getting wet feet, and like submersed wet feet for long periods, they start dying off. The same with reed canary grass.
I see. Elisa or Alyssa, you unmuted. Do you have a question you want to ask?
No, that was by accident. Sorry.
Okay, no worries. From Linda, how much does a hunter get usually for a beaver? What is done with a captured beaver now? And like pelts for furs, food?
Yeah, so right now I'm one of the only people in Oregon moving beavers alive. I learned from two folks in Tiller, and they work in the Roseburg area, and they also move beavers alive, Leonard and Lois Houston. Other than that, I don't think there's anyone. So Southern Oregon has got some beaver relocation, but nowhere else in Oregon that I know of is doing that. So lots of beavers are trapped and they all are killed. They're either killed by pest control companies because they got paid to come in and do that. I mean, Oregon has a license. It's funny because we outlawed market hunting, right? We were like, okay, after buffalo, after passenger pigeon, like we can't have the market connected with wildlife. That's a bad deal. All the wildlife dies. So we passed a series of laws. It was called the Northwest Model, and we disconnected the market from wildlife, except for we carved out fashion. If it's got fur and it can be used in fashion, then you can still kill without a bag limit for profit. So you can set up a business to kill wildlife for profit if it's for fashion. And you can also set up a business to kill wildlife for profit if it's wildlife that's bothering people. And so that's where beavers fall into both of those categories. And so there is no bag limit if you're recreationally hunting beavers. And there's no bag limit if you hang out your shingle as a wildlife control company and you start killing beavers for profit. And many of the companies in our area, you know, they'll charge $300 to $600 per beaver. And people pay that, you know, and you've got 8 beavers in a family. It's very profitable, and you know the family's going to be back next year because that's the best habitat in the region. It's very profitable to a company to go, you know, set an afternoon of traps. Up in Portland, the pest control companies up there are charging $1,000 an animal, and they'll go in and they'll set traps for an afternoon. They'll take out 12 animals, right? So there's a market, and yeah, that's just kind of how it works here if you want to profit. The pelts, they're worth anywhere between $15 and $30. It's not worth it. I mean, skinning a beaver is a bunch of work. They're really fatty, so you got to flesh them, you got to dry them and stretch them. Not worth it. But people still do that just for fun or for personal use of the pelts. The reason the fur market is so down right now is because the Russians started fur farming, and they have these massive factory farms, and all the beaver felt in the world now is produced by these huge beaver factory farms. And we've seen a little bump in fur prices recently because of that TV show Yellowstone. There's been this pretty market uptick in people wanting felt cowboy hats in the US. So thanks, Hollywood. They're worth more again. But yeah, that's kind of the market dynamics are really centered around pest control. And they're really folks who don't know that there's any other option. The pest control company shows up and they're not going to tell you about tree wrapping, because what can they charge for wrapping a tree versus, you know, in Portland, $1,000 a beaver gets impressive. You killed this big 60-pound animal, you know, you, the landowner, you weren't going to be able to do that. And that this person with the fancy truck showed up and did it. And then you shell out hundreds. Whereas really you could go wrap your tree. So I've had a really hard time convincing pest control companies to embrace any coexistence work because it's not as profitable. And the state asks them to try, but there's no teeth in that. So that's really the market. And it's still market driven. The reason we don't have a bunch of beavers in the Beaver State is because there's still a market, but it's the pest control market.
Interesting. That was the last of the questions I have in the chat, and I do see we are over more than a few minutes. Is there any other short questions? I saw also you entered your email into the chat if folks have things that come up later. And there are no other questions. Thank you so much, Jacob, for sharing all of this. I think it goes really well as well with, and it sounds like you may have worked with Caleb with Applegate Watershed and doing his work out in Chanterelle Buckley. And he gave a presentation on restoring riparian waterways focused on blackberries. Sounds like a lot of these really go hand in hand. So if you haven't seen the recording on restoring riparian waterways, go check that out on our YouTube channel, and we'll be sending out this recording probably shortly after the weekend. Takes a little while for us to get it uploaded and all that. So you will have that come to you in an email, the recording. Jacob, can we share your email along on that email?
Yeah, and I'll share the information on the beaver scavenger hunt as well. So yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for taking all this time. And nope, it sounds maybe there's one question. Oh, nope, maybe just someone signing off. Well, thank you so much for all this time, and remember, you can still sign up for the field class and join Jacob out in Cave Junction this weekend if you'd like to go and see that site and see beavers in action.
Cool. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you.